The air in the funeral home was heavy with a grief that was just moments from curdling into pure horror. It was that thick, silent grief that fills a room when a death you've been expecting for a long time finally arrives. Eleanor Vance had lived a full, if quiet life, and her family was there to say their last goodbyes. The funeral director, a man with a face as somber as his job title, moved to the head of the polished oak casket. With a soft click, he lifted the lid for the private family viewing. One of the sons, Daniel, his face a mask of sorrow, stepped forward. He reached out to touch his mother's hand one last time, a final memory to hold on to. But his hand froze, hovering in the cold air. He pulled back like he'd been burned. That wasn't her ring. His mother had worn the simple gold band his father gave her for 50 years. It was a part of her. This was a gaudy, silver thing with a cheap-looking stone. His eyes shot up from the hand to the face. That wasn't her dress. That wasn't her hair. That wasn't her face. Lying in their mother's casket was a complete stranger. A collective gasp seemed to suck all the air out of the room. And as the first wail of a new, more terrifying kind of grief echoed through the chapel, a single question hung in the air, screamed by every heart in the room. If that wasn't Mom, where was she? Before that moment of pure horror, the day had been shrouded in a predictable, quiet sadness. The Vance family had gathered at Grimshaw & Sons, the oldest funeral home in the small town of Northwood, a place where generations had marked the end of life with a certain dignity. Daniel Vance, now in his late 40s with his mother's kind eyes, was the one who'd made the arrangements. He was the dutiful son who stayed in town, the one who'd checked on his mother every single day for the past 10 years. He thought he knew everything about her. Standing beside him was his sister, Clara, a stark contrast to his open grief. She was a statue of composure, her sorrow locked away behind an almost severe expression. Clara had bolted from Northwood for the city the first chance she got, building a life as a high-powered corporate lawyer, a world away from home. Her relationship with their mother had always been more formal than affectionate, marked by weekly, almost perfunctory phone calls. Still, the moment she got the news, she was on the next flight, duty overriding the distance she had so carefully built. In their memories, Eleanor Vance was the quintessential small-town matriarch. She was known for her prize-winning rose garden, her volunteer work at the library, and the quiet strength she'd shown after her husband died 2 decades earlier. She was a woman of routine, a woman of principle. Her death at 78 had been reported as peaceful. The family doctor had signed the certificate. Natural causes, heart failure in her sleep. It was the gentle end everyone expected for a woman who lived such a gentle life. Or so they thought. The funeral home itself seemed to play along with this illusion of peace. Grimshaw & Sons was a classic Victorian, all dark wood paneling, stained glass windows, and the faint, sweet smell of lilies. Arthur Grimshaw, the third-generation owner, greeted Daniel and Clara with practiced solemnity, speaking in hushed tones about honoring Eleanor's memory and the comfort of tradition. This private viewing was supposed to be the hardest part, the moment they would face the physical reality of their loss. They steeled themselves for the familiar, peaceful face of their mother. They were prepared for a moment of quiet reflection, a final, silent conversation. They were prepared for sorrow, for tears, for the heavy weight of it all. They were not, in any way, prepared for the woman lying in that casket. Time seemed to bend in the seconds after Daniel's choked gasp. Clara, who had been holding back, strode forward, her lawyerly composure finally shattering. She peered into the casket, her sharp eyes scanning the stranger's face. The woman on the satin pillow was about the same age as Eleanor, with graying hair styled in a similar way, but that's where it ended. This woman's face was narrower, her cheekbones sharper. A small, faded scar sat above her left eyebrow. A scar Eleanor definitely did not have. Her hands, folded peacefully, belonged to someone else, thinner, with longer fingers, and wearing that ugly, unfamiliar ring. What is this? Clara's voice was a low, dangerous hiss. Arthur, what is the meaning of this? Arthur Grimshaw scurried forward from the doorway, his face a mask of utter confusion. I don't understand, he stammered, looking into the casket himself. Panic flickered in his eyes. There must be some mistake. The lighting, perhaps, the embalming process can sometimes alter. Aita. Daniel's voice, usually so mild, was now shaking with a rage he'd never felt before. He spun on the funeral director, his grief swallowed by white-hot fury. Do you think we don't know our own mother? This is not her. This is not Eleanor Vance. The accusation hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The other relatives, a few cousins, an elderly aunt, started murmuring, their own confusion turning to outrage. The carefully crafted solemnity of the day shattered. The chapel, once a sanctuary of grief, was now filling with panic and anger. Arthur Grimshaw's professional mask was melting. I assure you we followed all procedures, he insisted, his voice wavering. Our team retrieved Mrs. Vance from her home. She was tagged. The chain of custody was secure. This is impossible. But the impossible was lying right there in front of them. This wasn't some simple, tragic mix-up at a hospital. Eleanor had died at home. Grimshaw's men were the only ones who had touched the body. The journey from her quiet bedroom to this polished casket had been short and direct. There were no other bodies to get mixed up. Clara, her mind already racing, took control. The shock was giving way to the cold, analytical focus that made her a top-tier litigator. No one leaves this room, she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying. Arthur, you will give me the names of every single person who handled the body. Every employee on duty. I want a minute-by-minute timeline. Who are you calling? Daniel asked, his face ashen. The police, Clara said, her voice flat. This funeral is over. This is a crime scene. The word hung there, changing everything. The flowers, the music, the empty chairs waiting for mourners. It all suddenly looked sinister. The question wasn't just about a grotesque mistake anymore. It was about something far more terrifying. If this stranger was in their mother's casket, then their mother, who supposedly died peacefully in her bed, wasn't where she was supposed to be. And the most chilling thought of all began to dawn on them. Maybe she hadn't died peacefully at all. The arrival of the police cut through the funeral home's horrified confusion like a scalpel. Two detectives, a study in contrasts, stepped out of an unmarked car and into the bizarre scene. Detective Isabella Rossi was in her mid-30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to catch everything at once. She had a calm, empathetic way about her that could soothe even the most rattled witnesses. Her partner, Detective Ben Carter, was the opposite. He was older, grizzled, and just a few years shy of retirement, with a cynical shell hardened by decades of seeing the worst of people. He looked at the stately funeral home, at the family in their funeral clothes, and let out a low sigh. He'd seen a lot, but a potential homicide starting with a body swap at a funeral? That was a new one. The chapel was a strange sight. The casket sat open, a grim centerpiece. The Vance family was huddled together, their shock settling into a kind of numb, fearful quiet. Arthur Grimshaw was sweating buckets, pacing his office. Detective Rossi started with the family, her voice gentle. I am so sorry for your loss, and I'm incredibly sorry you're going through this, she said, looking at Daniel and Clara. We're going to do everything we can to figure this out. Daniel, his anger replaced by a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion, told the story. He described his mother, her last days, the call from the doctor. She was in her bed, he said, his voice cracking. The doctor said her heart just gave out. It was peaceful. That's what he said. Clara, however, was all business. She'd already written down a list of names, and a timeline from her grilling of Arthur Grimshaw. The body was picked up from my mother's house at approximately 7 a.m. yesterday by two of Grimshaw's employees, she stated crisply. Brought directly here. Arthur claims only he and a temporary mortician were involved in the prep. The viewing was for 2 p.m. today. Somewhere in that 31-hour window, my mother's body disappeared and was replaced by her. She gestured at the casket, her disgust obvious. While Rossi talked to the family, Detective Carter cornered Arthur Grimshaw. Carter leaned in the doorway of the director's ornate office, his expression unreadable. Walk me through it, Arthur, he said, his tone casual but firm. From the top. Don't leave anything out. Grimshaw, a man used to being in complete control of his somber little world, was coming apart at the seams. He repeated his story, twisting a handkerchief in his hands. He detailed the pickup, the standard procedures, the embalming. It was all by the book, detective, he pleaded. We have checklists. It's all documented. Who's this temp you had working? Carter asked, his eyes narrowing. Sarah Jenkins, Grimshaw said. A young woman, been with us a few months. Filling in. She's certified. Good at her job. Quiet. And where is she now? A fresh wave of sweat popped up on Grimshaw's forehead. That's the thing. She worked the late shift last night, finishing up. She was supposed to be in this morning but called in sick. Said she had a terrible flu. Carter's eyes flickered. A missing body and a missing employee. He wasn't a big believer in coincidences. The easy theory was a massive career-ending screw-up. But as Rossi and Carter talked outside, it just didn't add up. If it was a mix-up, where was the other family? Where was the frantic call from another funeral home or hospital reporting a missing body? Nothing. Eleanor Vance died at home. There was no other body to confuse her with. This wasn't a mix-up. This was a substitution. So we have two questions, Rossi said, thinking out loud. 1. Who is the woman in the casket? And 2, much more importantly, where is Eleanor Vance? Carter stared back at the funeral home, its stained glass windows seeming to mock the whole ugly mess. I've got a third question, Rossi, he grunted. Was Eleanor Vance's death really as peaceful as everyone thinks? The investigation was on. First step. Treat the woman in the casket not as a mistake, but as the first clue to a much darker puzzle. The medical examiner was called to take the Jane Doe to the county morgue. The serene chapel of Grimshaw and Sons was now officially what Clara had declared. The body of the unknown woman, now officially Jane Doe, became the silent center of the whole investigation. At the county morgue, away from the sweet smell of lilies, the stark, clinical facts started to surface. Pathologists went to work, trying to give a name to the woman who had stolen Eleanor Vance's final resting place. They ran her fingerprints through every database they could think of, local, state, federal. The results came back blank. No criminal record, no military service, no professional licenses. It was like she'd never officially existed. She was a ghost. Without an identity to compare them to, her dental records were useless. The autopsy gave them their first real piece of the puzzle. And it was a confusing one. The cause of death was an acute myocardial infarction, a massive heart attack. On the surface, it looked natural. She was about 75 with a history of heart disease. But the pathologist found something else, something subtle. Faint, yellowish bruises on her wrists, just starting to fade. They looked like old ligature marks, maybe a few weeks old. They weren't related to her death, but they hinted at a life that wasn't as peaceful as her end. For now it was just another question mark. With Jane Doe holding on to her secrets, Detectives Rossi and Carter turned their full attention back to the funeral home. They hit Grimshaw and Sons with warrants and a fine-toothed comb, ready to take that chain of custody apart piece by piece to find out when the swap happened. Arthur Grimshaw, facing the ruin of his family's reputation, gave them everything. Security footage, employee logs, every scrap of paper on Eleanor Vance. The detectives spent hours glued to the screens. They watched the Grimshaw and Sons van pull up to the Vance house. They watched two employees carry out a body bag. They watched the van return to the funeral home. It all looked perfectly normal, but Carter, with his eye for tiny details, spotted it, a blind spot. The camera covering the back entrance to the prep room had been offline for 2 hours during the night shift. Grimshaw swore it was just a recurring glitch, a faulty wire he kept meaning to fix. To Detective Carter, it felt less like a glitch and more like an open invitation. That 2-hour window happened during the shift of the temporary mortician, Sarah Jenkins. The quiet, reliable temp who suddenly got sick and vanished. Her name shot to the top of their suspect list. They ran her name. Sarah Jenkins, age 26, clean record. Her address was a small apartment across town. But when a patrol car got there, the place was cleared out. The landlord said she'd paid her rent in cash 2 days ago and he hadn't seen her since. She'd left behind nothing but some trash. The apartment of a ghost. Sarah Jenkins wasn't just a person of interest anymore. She was a prime suspect. A theory started to form. Jenkins, for some unknown reason, Used the dead of night and that camera blind spot to swap the bodies. But that just opened a new can of worms. Where did she get another body? Jane Doe died of a heart attack. It's not like Jenkins could just find a fresh victim in an alley. And why? What could a temp mortician possibly gain from a stunt this bizarre and risky? The detectives were stuck. They had a nameless dead woman, a missing mortician, and no Eleanor Vance. They were chasing shadows. It was time to stop looking at the how of the swap and start digging into the why. It was time to find out who Eleanor Vance really was. Maybe the quiet, respectable matriarch wasn't so simple after all. Maybe the secrets they needed weren't in the funeral home, but hidden in Eleanor's own life. The search for the real Eleanor Vance began. The detectives started peeling back the layers of a life everyone in Northwood thought they knew. They reconstructed her last weeks, talking to everyone who'd crossed her path. Neighbors, the grocery store cashier, the librarian, members of her garden club. A consistent picture formed, but it was painted in faded colors. Eleanor was polite but private, a creature of habit who had become more withdrawn in her final months. Her friends from the garden club mentioned she'd started skipping meetings, which was unheard of for her. The librarian said Eleanor seemed anxious, often lost in thought. These were small things, easily dismissed as just signs of old age. But now, seen through the lens of a criminal investigation, they felt heavy. Then they looked at her finances, and that's where they found the first real crack in the facade. Eleanor lived modestly on her late husband's pension and Social Security. Her bank records showed a frugal, predictable life, bills, groceries, a small monthly church donation. But about 6 months before her death, a new pattern started. Every single week, like clockwork, she withdrew $200 in cash. And she never used the same ATM, often driving to neighboring towns to use a different machine. For a woman who rarely left Northwood and used her debit card for everything, these secret cash withdrawals were a massive red flag. Who or what was she spending this money on? Rossi and Carter brought Daniel and Clara in again. They needed the family's take on these new discoveries. Daniel was floored. $200 a week? In cash. That makes no sense. My mother counted every penny. She would have called that a terrible waste. Clara, however, seemed annoyed by the questions. My mother was a private woman, detective, she said sharply. She's the victim here. I fail to see how her spending habits are relevant. Your mother's body is missing and a stranger was in her casket, Carter countered, his patience wearing thin. Everything about her life is relevant. Did she have any old friends, or maybe some not-so-friendly relatives, who might have been hitting her up for cash? Clara's jaw tightened. No. There was no one. The interview was a brick wall. Daniel was lost in his grief, and Clara was on the defensive. The detectives felt like they were missing a huge piece of the family puzzle. Just when the trail felt like it was going cold, a break came from the morgue. While doing a final, meticulous check of the Jane Doe's clothing, the pathologist's assistant felt a small, hard object stitched into the hem of the woman's simple dress. She carefully unpicked the stitches, and a small, old-fashioned brass key fell out. It wasn't for a house or a car. It was the kind of key used for a padlock or, as Detective Rossi instantly recognized, a private postal box. This was it. The first real thread they could pull. Rossi took the key and started the painstaking work of checking every private mail service and post office in a 50-mile radius. It took 2 days, but she finally got a hit. The key belonged to a P.O. box at a small shipping store 30 miles away. The box was registered to a Mary Higgins, but the address on the application was a vacant lot, another fake identity. But the clerk remembered Mary. He described a nervous, elderly woman who came in once a month and always paid in cash. And he gave them one more critical detail. On the application, in the space for a forwarding it, they were about to uncover a secret that Eleanor Vance, or someone very close to her, had paid a steep price to keep hidden. Their next stop was that apartment complex, a place they felt certain held the answers to who Jane Doe was, and what really happened to Eleanor Vance. The apartment building was a grim, concrete block that smelled of damp and despair, a universe away from Eleanor Vance's manicured lawn. As Rossi and Carter walked down the dim hallway, they could feel the whole story of their case shifting into a much darker key. The apartment they wanted was at the end of the hall. The landlord, a weary man who'd seen it all. Let them in. The air inside was stale, but the small apartment was surprisingly neat. It was the home of someone who lived a transient life, ready to leave at a moment's notice. There were almost no personal items, but on a simple nightstand in the bedroom lay a small, black, leather-bound diary. Carter picked it up with a gloved hand and opened the cover. The first page read, "The property of Clara Vance." Rossi and Carter looked at each other, a wave of stunned understanding passing between them. This wasn't Jane Doe's apartment. This was Clara's secret. They started to read. The neat, controlled handwriting told a story so monstrous, so filled with pain and fury, that it made the discovery in the funeral home seem like a quiet prologue. The story started 20 years ago, when Clara was 16. The woman everyone in Northwood knew as Eleanor Vance was not her mother. She was her aunt Rose Thorne. The real Eleanor Vance, Rose's older sister and Clara's actual mother, had been a kind, gentle woman. Rose was the opposite, volatile, jealous, and greedy. One summer, Rose came to visit, and after a terrible fight over the family inheritance, she murdered Eleanor and staged it to look like a car accident. Daniel was just a little kid, too young to understand. But Clara knew. She'd overheard the fight. She saw the chilling look in her aunt's eyes. Rose threatened her into silence, promising to hurt Daniel if she ever told a soul. So for 2 decades, Clara lived in an unimaginable hell, forced to call her mother's killer mother. She watched this monster live her mother's life, tend her mother's garden, and steal the love of her unsuspecting brother. The diary was her only escape, the only place she could scream the truth. It was filled with 20 years of hatred, fear, and a slowly simmering plan for revenge. The diary laid out the final act. When Rose Thorne, the woman they all knew as Eleanor, started suffering from a real heart condition, Clara saw her opening. As a lawyer, she knew about obscure, slow-acting poisons that could mimic heart failure. For weeks, she had been giving her aunt small, untraceable doses, carefully orchestrating a death that a doctor would sign off on as natural causes. She had murdered the woman who murdered her mother. But for Clara, that wasn't enough. Justice had to be absolute. She didn't just want Rose dead. She wanted her erased, wiped from existence. Her plan was as twisted as her trauma. She'd found a fixer online, a woman who specialized in creating new identities, a con artist named Mary Higgins. She paid her a large sum of cash to get a replacement body. The plan was this. After Rose died, Clara would have Mary Higgins swap the bodies at the funeral home. Rose's body would be taken to a private crematorium under a fake name and burned to ash. In her place, the anonymous Jane Doe, Mary Higgins herself, would be buried as Eleanor Vance. It was a ghoulish, convoluted, but in Clara's mind, perfect poetic justice. But the plan imploded. Mary Higgins, the woman now in the casket, had a week. The funeral home employees found a body on their prep table in the morning, assumed it was Eleanor Vance, and prepared her for viewing. The quiet temp, Sarah Jenkins, had nothing to do with anything. She was just a convenient red herring who genuinely got the flu and vanished from the story. The detectives sat in the silent, grim apartment, the diary between them. The entire, horrifying truth was laid bare. This wasn't a body swap. This was a story of a murder 20 years ago, and a second murder for revenge. The woman in the casket wasn't a villain. She was a hired pawn who died by a fluke of fate. The real killer wasn't some phantom mortician. She was the grieving daughter, the stoic lawyer. A woman who had hidden one monster's secret, and then become a monster herself. Armed with the diary, Rossi and Carter drove back to the Vance house. They found Clara in the backyard, standing by the famous rose garden. She was staring at a patch of freshly disturbed earth, and Rossi had a sudden, sick feeling they were about to find the body of Rose Thorne. "Clara Vance," Rossi said, her voice soft but firm. "We need you to come with us." Clara didn't turn around. She just nodded slowly. "Did you find it?" she asked quietly. "My diary?" "We did," Rossi replied. Clara finally turned to face them. The mask was gone. In its place was a profound, chilling emptiness. "Then you know," she said. "You know what she did. And you know what I had to do." There was no remorse in her voice, only the hollow echo of a justice she had waited 20 years to claim. Clara Vance's confession sent shockwaves through Northwood, turning a bizarre mystery into a dark, generational tragedy. She was arrested right there, her chilling calm never breaking as she was read her rights in the shadow of the rose garden that had been both her mother's pride and her aim. Following her directions, police dug up the body of the woman the world knew as Eleanor Vance from a shallow grave under the prize-winning roses. The autopsy confirmed everything in the diary. Slow, systematic poisoning designed to look like a heart attack. The woman in the casket was officially identified as Mary Higgins, a small-time grifter with a long rap sheet for fraud, whose last con ended with her own unexpected death. The hardest blow, of course, fell on Daniel Vance. His entire life was shattered. The woman he had loved and mourned was not his mother, but his aunt and his mother's killer. His sister, the one he'd always seen as distant but dependable, was a murderer. His grief was replaced by a dizzying vortex of horror and betrayal. He hadn't just lost one family member, he'd lost his entire family, his entire history, in one devastating tidal wave of truth. The legal case against Clara was a nightmare. Her defense argued extreme psychological duress, painting a picture of a young girl held hostage by a monstrous secret for 2 decades. They claimed her actions, while illegal, were the direct result of a justice system that had failed her. The prosecution, on the other hand, portrayed her as a cold, calculating killer who took the law into her own hands. Public opinion was fiercely split. To some, Clara was a monster, no better than her aunt. To others, she was a tragic anti-hero, a victim who finally fought back. Her story became a grim national obsession, a cautionary tale about the darkness hiding behind pristine, suburban walls. As for the real Eleanor Vance, murdered 20 years earlier, her remains were never found. Rose had disposed of her sister's body with cold efficiency, erasing her from the world long before Clara tried to do the same to her. When you look back on it all, the story of the Vances is a chilling reminder of how a single, violent act can ripple across generations. Rose Thorne's murderous greed didn't just end one life. It poisoned an entire family, twisted a young girl's mind into a weapon, and ultimately destroyed the lives of her own children. The secret, festering in silence for 20 years, finally erupted into a tragedy that consumed everyone it touched. Clara's quest for justice was born from an unimaginable trauma. For 2 decades, she lived with the monster under her own roof, forced to call it mother. She did succeed in erasing Rose Thorne, but the cost was everything. To destroy the monster that haunted her, she had to become one herself. She traded her prison of silence for a literal one, sacrificing her future to right a wrong from the distant past. It leaves you with a deeply unsettling question about the nature of justice, revenge, and the breaking point of a human soul. When vengeance is all you have left, does the cost even matter? It's a question without an easy answer, and I'm curious to know what you think in the comments below. If you found this story as strange and dark as I did, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want to make sure you don't miss our next trip into the shadows, be sure to subscribe to the channel. The case left a legacy of unanswered questions and broken lives. Daniel Vance eventually sold the family home, unable to live with the ghosts in the garden. The town of Northwood returned to its quiet rhythm, but the story of Eleanor Vance became a piece of local folklore, a whispered warning that you never really know what goes on behind closed doors. It's a stark reminder that some family secrets don't just stay buried. They lie in wait, ready to claw their way to the surface and destroy everything in their path. The horror for the Vance family didn't start when they opened a casket and found a stranger. It started 20 years earlier, with a secret that was always, one way or another, going to demand a reckoning.